Not so long ago in our history in this country, we had a great dreamer, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., give a speech entitled, "I Have a Dream." All of us are probably very familiar with that speech, having studied it at some point in school, or maybe revisiting it in our own time. A dream about what America could be, what it should be, based on the promises laid out before this community over 250 years ago. But MLK, in that moment in the mid-60s, called America back to the promises made at the beginning, at its founding, and saying that he wanted America to make good on the check that it had written. "I have a dream," King proclaimed. Just a few years later, on April 4th, 1968, King was visiting Memphis, Tennessee for a sanitation workers' strike, staying at the Lorraine Motel, preparing to organize and lead a demonstration on behalf of the workers, when a shot rang out as King stood on the balcony outside room 306, and he fell, dying a short time later. Now, if you go to the Lorraine Motel today in Memphis, Tennessee, which is now the National Civil Rights Museum, if you go look at room 306 from the parking lot, you'll notice that there's a plaque on the ground right before the balcony of room 306. And on this plaque are the words from our story today. "Here comes the dreamer. Let us kill him and see what becomes of his dream." How could it get so bad? How could a family that's born in love and promise and hope, not just Joseph's family with his 12 siblings, but the family we call the United States, the family we call humanity, how could it get so bad that the dreams we have for ourselves and for our world together could be cut down in violence, stamped on by hatred, turning into a nightmare? Here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him, and let's see what becomes of his dream. How did it get this way? I want to remind you where we've been over this past summer as we've been going through the stories of Genesis. We've been following these mothers and fathers of our lineage, these ancient figures who we look to and we learn from about their relationship with God as they continually wrestle with who God is calling them to be in the midst of a world that is challenging them to be somebody else. And if you've been paying attention, if you've been here frequently during the summer, or you've been keeping up, you'll notice that one of the major themes in these ancient mothers and fathers stories is family dynamics, and a very dysfunctional dynamic at that. Professor John Burnham, who is a member of this congregation, preached on the story of Abraham sending his son Ishmael out into the desert with his mother, Rahab, abandoning Rahab and Ishmael to the harsh wilderness in favor of his other son, Isaac. And then you heard Lauren Brown preach on how Abraham nearly sacrificed his preferred son, Isaac, on Mount Moriah. And then later on, we learned about Abraham's kid, Isaac, being married to a woman named Rebekah. And Isaac and Rebekah continue the family tradition of dysfunctional families by pitting sons against each other. They both have their preferred son, Jacob and Esau. Isaac, the father, prefers Esau, while Rebekah prefers Jacob. And these two sons, twins they are, continually spend their lives wrestling with each other because they've been pitted against one another. Then we spent some time with Jacob, who was trying to find his own way in life, and he ends up marrying sisters, his cousins, Rachel and Leah, and we saw how dysfunctional that got when Jacob realized quickly that he couldn't love them equally. He was unable to. And now we are in yet another generation, the fourth generation. Jacob, now named Israel, has had 13 kids, 12 sons. And the second youngest of his kids is a son named Joseph, who was the firstborn of his favorite wife, Rachel. And what does the story tell us today in chapter 37? Jacob continues the family tradition. He's got a favorite, and he lets the others know about it. We see generations of dysfunction and terrible family dynamics playing out. And this is one of the things we value most about the scriptures, is that these people we call figures of faith are not perfect. They're not holy, immaculate, unattainable examples. They are real people in the sense that they're complicated. They've got a past. They continue to mess up and fall on their faces. And yet, they're called God's people. So we can relate to them in some sense because we too know what it's like to make mistakes. We too know what it's like to live in messy families. We too know what it's like to have dynamics of dysfunction play out both in our lives and in the lives of generations before us and after us. We know that it takes work and time and attention to deal with those dynamics. But what's troubling about Joseph's story here, now in the fourth generation of the covenant promises between God and the family of Abraham, what's troubling here is that rivalry has taken a physical form. No longer is it just jealous thoughts or heated words or even threats of violence, but what we see here now when it comes to Joseph and his brothers is words turning into action. That the brothers of Joseph, who are jealous because of how their father is behaving, the brothers of Joseph turn on him and make a plan to kill him. It's troubling. It's dark. Throughout the 1960s in the United States, particularly in the lives of Black Americans and the civil rights movement, the language of dreams was often popping up. You heard about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Perhaps you're familiar with Langston Hughes' famous poem, Harlem, which begins with the line, "What happens to a dream deferred?" That poem was very influential in the life of Martin Luther King Jr., who struggled alongside people to make dreams become a reality in our country, to make America pay out what it had promised to all people who fall under our society and its vision for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you look at our history of the United States, you might quickly conclude that God doesn't seem to be very interested or perhaps very involved in what's going on. Heck, it doesn't take going back to the 1960s to make this conclusion. Turn on the news today. Log into social media. And very quickly, as you read the headlines or you pay attention to the posts, you might think, where is God? Is God even present? Does God even care? Maybe it's not just the public headlines, but maybe it's your own life, whether you live in messy families or perhaps because of your own decisions that could have easily been avoided. You might still take time and upon further reflection conclude that God must not have a hand in this. God must have withdrawn or rejected us because of how we've behaved, how we failed to be God's people. Maybe we haven't done the right things or enough good things to earn God's favor and attention. And so we think that God has just left us. What's interesting about the Joseph narrative in the book of Genesis is the previous three generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God seems to be very active in the story, speaking directly to the fathers and the mothers and intervening on their behalf, doing things directly to either make something happen or to stop something from happening. God has a very active, immediate role. But then when we get to Genesis 37, there's a change. In the Joseph narrative, God's not so imminent, so close. God's not speaking or acting directly. In fact, the closest God seems to get to Joseph or any of the characters from this point forward in Genesis is acting in dreams. Hazy, abstract, hard to interpret dreams. And the part of the story we didn't read, I know you find that hard to believe because we read a lot of the story this morning. The part of the story we didn't read today is Joseph having some dreams. And you get a sense, if you go back and read those words, you get a sense of why the brothers couldn't stand the youngest child. Spoiled, narcissistic. You see, Joseph has these dreams of how he interprets it, being made the greatest among the 13 siblings, that he will be raised up and the rest will bow down before him because of what God's going to do. And in fact, he has a second dream where not only are his siblings groveling, humbling themselves before him, but even mom and dad are on their knees too, praising him, asking for mercy. That feels like an unforced error from Joseph, right? Like he could have just kept his mouth shut. But you add that with the tattletaling when he tells on his brothers about their behavior. You add that to the favoritism that Jacob displays toward Joseph, making him a long, fancy robe. And all of a sudden, we get a recipe for disaster. But what's interesting here is we still have questions about why certain things happen. Why does Jacob send Joseph to the fields, into the wilderness, all by himself, when he knows the dynamic between Joseph and his brothers? Why does Joseph appear so willingly to go? Why does Joseph get sent to Shechem? Shechem, just a few chapters earlier, is the site of a massacre where some of Joseph's brothers have single-handedly destroyed a city for their actions against their sister Dinah. Shechem is the place where all the men are killed and the possessions plundered. And yet Joseph goes straight back to that place, that site of violence. And where is God? Where is God in the midst of all this? Perhaps Joseph's story is more relatable than we initially think. Because I think all of us have had those questions before. Maybe not about the details of Genesis 37, but I think all of us have asked the question, where is God? And what we get here in this story is perhaps a more relatable depiction of God's action in our lives than we care to admit. That for a lot of our life, God is not speaking directly to us. God is not intervening and changing our lives without our say-so, but God seems to be distant or elusive or perhaps even absent. And I think it's good for us as a people of faith to be honest about that faith can often be a struggle, that this connection we have to God is not as perfect or intimate as we want it to be. Joseph goes to the fields and eventually is directed to Dothan, where the terrible events unfold. Rather than finding himself in a position of status, being raised up and elevated before his brothers, he's cast down into a pit. And horrifyingly, his brothers just eat lunch right next to it. Perhaps hearing their brothers' cries as they consume food. And it seems like at this moment in the story, the dreams Joseph has had have been dashed, destroyed. That he's on a 180 the opposite way, not being raised up, but going down into Egypt, to use the familiar language of Scripture. Not being made into an elevated status, but now sold into slavery without any identity or rights of his own. Seems like the dream is over. Nearly 9 years before his assassination, Martin Luther King preached a sermon in Montgomery, Alabama to his congregation that he titled Unfulfilled Hopes. And the driving question of this sermon was, what do you do when you find your dreams unrealized, your hopes unfulfilled, and you see no basic solution in your world to the problem you are facing? He asked this question not just to the people as a collective, right? To Black Americans who are struggling to have rights, to have a say and a voice in the southern United States, but he asked it to them as individuals. What do you do when you feel like the dreams you have for your life aren't coming to fruition? Perhaps you thought you'd be in a certain place or have certain relationships. Maybe you thought life was going to go a certain way, but for whatever reason, it hasn't panned out. This is what King said in his sermon preached in 1959. You stand up in your circumstances when you find yourself in that role. You stand up. You stand amid your problem. You face the fact that your hopes are unfulfilled. And then you say, I have one thing left. Life has beaten it down. It has broken away from me many things, sometimes my physical body, but at least it has left me with a will. And I will assert this, and I refuse to be stopped. When it seems like life is falling apart and the dreams have been dashed or destroyed, we are left with a will, a sense of courage and conviction, perseverance. That even though everything seems to be working against us, we can still say, I will not give up. King asserts that we can do this in a later sermon that he titled Shattered Dreams. We can continue to have a will and assert our dignity and assert our agency because, as a people of faith, we have an infinite hope. We have a hope that's not touched by conditional, physical, earthly circumstances. We have a hope that is God. And as long as God is, we can continue to survive, to struggle, to put one foot in front of the other, to do the next right thing, to take what seems like a prison and decorate it, to make it a place where life can bloom, even in the midst of death. When dreams are left unfulfilled, hopes are left unrealized, we still have a will. What we learn here in Genesis 37 is that Joseph's story doesn't end here. In fact, it gets worse, if you can believe it. Not only do his brothers sell him into slavery, make money off him, because it's too far to actually murder your brother, but selling him will do that. He goes to Egypt, and he eventually, through a series of events that are not his fault, he gets thrown into a dungeon, left for dead. But even there, even in the darkness of a prison, Joseph doesn't give up. We'll take a pause here. And we will pray for whatever situation that is. You see, when we can't do anything else, we can pray. We can say, I will continue. I won't give up. And we can trust that that's the divine work in us, continuing to breathe life and power and the hope of a new tomorrow into us. So I don't know what dreams you've had for your life. I don't know where you thought you'd be today. Maybe life's going just the way you intended, and that's great. But I suspect that for many of us, some things have turned out differently. Some things have happened or haven't happened. What I want to tell you is that the dream doesn't die. The dream doesn't get destroyed. That even when we feel like the dream's been taken out of our hands, the one who gives us the dream continues to hold it for us when we cannot hold it any longer. Walter Brueggemann, who's a famous Old Testament scholar, says that the dream does not depend on the father, who is Jacob, or the brothers, or even Joseph. The dream is at work on its own in this story, that God has not abandoned the dream. Even when Joseph is sold into slavery, sent down into Egypt, left for dead and abandoned in a prison cell, the dream has not died. God continues to hold the dream. Here comes the dreamer, the brothers say. Let us kill him and see what becomes of his dream. What became of that dream that Martin Luther King pointed us to and carried for us for some years in his ministry? Perhaps that dream hasn't been fully and totally realized for all of us in this country. But neither did it die. We're on our way. We're on our way, as Fannie Lou Hamer, the great civil rights activist, said. It doesn't just have to be a dream for our country or for our world. It can be a dream in your own personal life. We're on our way. It may not be the way you intended. The path may be looking like Egypt right now and not the Holy of Holies, not the heights of Jerusalem. Perhaps it looks more like a cross than a throne. But we're on our way. The dream hasn't died. God carries the dream. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.